For this video, we're going to be looking at Chapter 2 in your textbook for this week, and our topic is God, Humanity, and Human Dignity. Again, this is part of the GCU Ethical and Spiritual Decision Making in Healthcare course. As always, I'm going to want to make sure that I emphasize that you read carefully through your textbook. I'm not going to cover everything in this lecture, so don't think of this lecture as a substitute for reading the text, because there are many things in the text that I'm not going to be able to cover here. But I want to take some time to talk about some of the big concepts that people sometimes struggle with when they're working through this chapter. So the essential questions for this week are questions like, what does it mean to be a human being? Or why does a human being have value? So these might seem like obvious questions, but when you start digging into them, what you'll see is some of the conflict that we have over big moral issues in our culture today, and really big conflicts that have happened, ethical conflicts that have happened throughout history, have been built off of different answers to these first two questions. And these first two questions get into another big question, which is what is meant by the concept of personhood. Because as you'll see here in just a moment, throughout history, bioethicists, and even just different cultures that have wrestled through different moral issues, have oftentimes disagreed by what is meant by a person. So are all human beings considered persons? Or just some human beings are considered persons? And if that seems like a strange question, again, as we're working through the material for this class, I hope you'll see why that's a significant question for us to think carefully about. And the last big essential question for this chapter is, what are the practical implications for the value of human beings within a healthcare context? And that's something that you're going to be working out on the discussion board for this week, as well as in your assignment for this week. So let's begin with human beings and value. What is it that a human being is, and what makes a human being valuable? Well, last week we talked about big worldview questions and how we briefly touched on a naturalistic worldview versus a Christian worldview. We talked about scientism, postmodernism as different epistemic worldviews. For this week, when we're digging into what does it mean to be a human being, I want to connect that idea to our ideas about God, or our ideas about ultimate reality. Because within the Christian worldview, ultimate reality is a person. And actually, if you want to be more specific about this, ultimate reality is three persons: the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So there's one God who exists as three persons. Christianity is a theistic worldview, or another way to say it, it's a dualistic worldview. So theism is a form of dualism. There are other forms of dualism too, such as Platonic dualism. We're not going to get into that here. But what you need to know for now is that theism is a form of dualism. And what dualism means is that there is one part of reality that is ultimate. There's one part of reality that is necessary. You can't even imagine this part of reality to not exist. For the Christian, ultimate reality is this triune God of Scripture. If you're a Jew or if you're a Muslim, you would also say that ultimate reality is God, just God doesn't exist as three persons. God is one person. It's a Unitarian theistic worldview, but still a dualistic worldview in Judaism and Islam. But for Christianity, God, the triune God, is ultimate reality. And then this God created a universe, as we talked about last week, and created humans in his own image. And so on a dualistic worldview, God is ultimate reality, and creation and humans, image bearers, are contingent realities. For something to be contingent, all that means is that it doesn't have to exist. Or you could say it another way. You could say you could imagine this thing not existing, or this person not existing. So there is a possible world. We could state it this way. There's a possible world where I was never born. And if that possible world were to play out, I wouldn't exist, even though everything else in the world would exist. There is a possible world. So again, when we're talking about possible worlds, it's not like an actual world. It's just a hypothetical, the way things could have been. There is a possible world where GCU would not be a university today. So the university is a contingent thing. It doesn't have to exist. But then once you start thinking about all the things that might not exist, really it's hard to find a limit. It's possible for humans to never come on the scene. It's possible for this earth to not exist, for the universe to not exist. And if it's possible for a thing to not exist, it means that that thing, or if we're talking about persons, if it's possible for a person to not exist, it means that those things are contingent. Well, on the Christian worldview, there is a dualism. There's a thing that's the really real, the ultimate reality, and that is God. God can't possibly not exist. God is where reality starts, and creation and image bearers are contingent. They only exist because they're derived from God. And so what is this contingent reality that we live in? Well, we're talking about the creation. So from a Christian perspective, creation is, it's the whole universe that we observe around us. And as we study it, we learn a lot of things about what the universe is. We learn about the properties of the universe. And it turns out that the universe can basically be reduced. This is a simplified reduction here, but time, space, and matter. And so time, space, and matter, from a Christian perspective, begins to exist. And furthermore, time, space, and matter is created by the Word of God. And so this is where we get the Greek word logos. So in the beginning was the logos, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. As you read through Genesis 1, you see that God speaks and creation comes into existence. And that theological understanding of creation is one of the reasons why we call the universe a cosmos. There's an order to it. There's a logic to the cosmos. And if there's a logic to it, it means it can be studied. It's a cosmos that we live in, not a chaos, as we'll talk about here in a moment. But human beings are created in the image of God. We are the imago Dei, which means if reality begins with a person called God, or with a tri-person, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and we're created in the image of these persons, then we are also persons. That's what it means to be an image bearer. At least one of the things of what it means to be an image bearer. Now we can contrast that with naturalism. So what is naturalism? Well, naturalism, as we talked about last week, is not a dualistic worldview. It's a monistic worldview. So if dualism means two, monism means one. So naturalism and monism go together. In the words of Carl Sagan, the universe, or he uses the phrase the cosmos, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but the cosmos is all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. Well, that is naturalism. Ultimate reality is the universe, or we could say it another way, ultimate reality is a non-person. It's not a personal agent. And so if we think about what is the universe, well, we've already talked about the universe as time, space, and matter, but now there's a real question that comes up when we think about naturalism, and that is chaos versus cosmos. Why would Carl Sagan say the cosmos? Because cosmos implies that the universe is orderly, that it's logical, that it can be studied. And by the way, it has to be if we're going to do science. If the universe is completely chaotic and there's no rhyme or reason to it, then you can't actually understand it because there's no rhyme or reason for it. Well, why would we have this question about chaos versus cosmos? Well, if we think about what it means for the universe to not, or ultimate reality to not be a person, what that means is that there was no thought going into the development or creation of the universe. There were no plans, there was no reason. All that exists is matter and motion. And why would we assume that matter and motion would be reasonable at all? This is the big question that the naturalist has to answer. But then we also have this question when we're thinking about naturalism, where on Christian theism you have God as ultimate reality and the universe is contingent. Well, if contingency just means you can imagine a thing to not exist, well, when you start thinking about the universe, can you imagine the universe to not exist? And it seems like we can. And to understand why, I think it might be helpful to think about naturalism in terms of its story. So remember, we can explain a worldview in terms of a set of beliefs, or we can explain a worldview as a story. If we're thinking about the naturalistic worldview according to a story, This story begins with time, space, and matter. In the beginning, a universe comes into existence. Well, if you're a naturalist, how did it come into existence? Well, it wasn't from God. It was from something that wasn't God. And we're going to talk about what that was for a moment. But somehow about 13, 14 billion years ago, a universe, the singularity, and the singularity is just this. I mean, it's even hard to say a moment of time. It's T0, where the distance between one side of the galaxy and the other side of the galaxy is literally zero. That singularity begins to expand, and a universe begins to expand. Fast forward a little bit, and this universe that's expanding rapidly eventually starts to form planets. And one of those planets is our own planet called Earth. Now, about 4.5 billion years ago, when you have the formation of our planet gets far enough away from the sun where it is hospitable for life. Life doesn't exist yet, but it's far enough and has all the right chemistry, all the right properties needed for life to begin. And this is our planet, and life begins about 4 billion years ago, according to this naturalistic story. Fast forward a little bit more, you have, a whole story of evolution, which we don't have time to get into here, but eventually you have the origin of humans. And again, according to the story, this is about 140,000 years ago, give or take about 40,000 years. That's when Homo sapiens. Now, I want you to think about this story because according to the naturalistic story, everything before humanity was just matter in motion. And if you think about everything before humanity, it's just everything can be explained sort of as a third-person perspective. If you've taken English before, you could write in a third-person point of view or a first-person point of view. Well, everything at this point, the story is just you can't understand anything from a first-person perspective because matter doesn't think, motion doesn't think, time, space, matter, they don't think. It's just matter in motion. But then at some point in the story, this third-person story becomes a first-person story. It's astonishing. If you're a naturalist or, regardless of what you believe, this is absolutely astonishing. How is it that matter in motion, a third-person perspective, can sort of miraculously have the lights turn on from the inside and you have a first-person perspective? Well, according to the story, somehow that happened, and now you have Homo sapiens about 140,000 years ago. The lights turn on and they start wondering, what is the purpose of all this? How am I supposed to survive in this world of survival of the fittest? What is everything for? And humans start to think, they start to imagine, they start to have hopes and dreams, all of that. And then you fast forward a little bit, and this is your birth on the screen right now. Now, none of this timeline is to scale. It just fits on this screen, and that's all I can do. But if it was to scale, it would be a long, long timeline. But somewhere in the story, you're born. And somewhere in the story, you're going to die. And from a cosmic perspective, that's coming very quick. You're here for a moment and you're gone the next moment. Your life is, to use biblical words, but a vapor. Well, that's also true if naturalism is true. Your life is just a split second from a cosmic perspective. And then if you go to the end of the story, this is the end of the story, eventually our planet or our sun is going to get hot enough to where it's going to burn up all of the life on our planet. And there's going to be no life here on Earth anymore. And in case if you think, well, maybe we can escape that oncoming death. Now, obviously, this is way in the future, but there's no likelihood that we're going to be able to escape this death. Because even if we were going to build spaceships to travel the universe, well, our galaxy is on a collision course with the Andromeda galaxy. And the chances of us getting out of our galaxy is almost nothing, which means that this existence that we're knowing, this first-person perspective, is almost certainly going to end. Let alone, if you talk about the heat death of the universe or whatever, this universe is heading to nothing. So you might say that this story begins with, you might say it begins with nothing and it ends with nothing. Now, why do I say that? Well, if we're telling this worldview according to a naturalistic perspective, this might be the way that you talk about it. But again, we can also talk about it as a set of beliefs. So we could step outside the universe, step outside of creation, and look at it sort of as though it's a physical object. And what the images that you see on the screen right now, is supposed to represent that. So this whole story plays out in this universe. Now, when I ask the question, is the universe contingent? What I'm asking is, can you imagine this universe not existing? You could imagine you not existing. You could imagine Homo sapiens never coming on the scene. You can imagine the Earth never developing life. You can imagine there never being an Earth. But what happens if you get rid of the entire universe? What happens if you get rid of matter, time, and space? What is this? Once you get rid of everything. And this is why I ask the question, can the universe really be contingent? Because you can imagine it not existing. But when you imagine it not existing, what is the white space on your screen that you're imagining everything out of existence, and now what's left? What is left? Well, when I have discussions in the classroom about this, I remember several years ago I was in a philosophy classroom with about 100 students. And I did this thought experiment with all of the students in the room, and I asked them, what is this white space? And the students were calling out, and I just said in one word, call out your answers, and students were calling out different answers. And what was funny about one time when I did this this discussion is one student yelled out the word nothing, and at the exact same time, another student yelled everything. It was a mind-blowing experience for many students in the classroom. So one student looked at this white space and said, it's nothing. The other student said, it's everything. So I asked the student who said it was nothing, I said, why did you say that the word nothing? Why did that word come to your mind? And he said, well, the universe is everything. And so if you get rid of everything, what you have left is nothing. And I said, okay, that makes sense. So I turned to the student who said everything, and I asked that student, why did you say everything and not nothing? And the student said, well, I was about to say nothing, but then I thought about it for a moment, and I thought, if there really was nothing, then there would be no potential. Because potential is a thing. And so I thought about the word nothing, and if there was really nothing, there's no potential, therefore there's no potential to create a universe, therefore it can't be nothing, it has to be something. And he said, I don't know what the something is, so I just said everything. And I said, that is very interesting. And so we had a debate after that in class where we had to talk, and I had them break into groups, and I said, I want you to discuss what is the difference between nothing and everything. This is exactly the type of thing philosophers love to talk about. What is the difference between nothing and everything? And I wanted them to list out the differences. Try to give me properties of what it means for something to be nothing and properties of what it means for something to be everything. And we had a great discussion after that. But at some point in the discussion, I had another student who rose his hand, and he said, why can't we just say the white space is God? And I actually think this is the Christian perspective. Because if you think about when somebody uses the word nothing created the universe, what they're saying is something, so they're not really thinking of nothing. They're thinking of a reality that's not time, so time didn't create time. It has to be something outside of time. It wasn't space, because space was part of the universe that was created. It began to exist. And it wasn't matter. It was outside of matter. So it has to be outside of that. So if you use the word nothing, you're thinking something that's not time, not space, not matter. Well, we're starting to give the properties of God, but what would be nothing, and how would nothing be different than God? I think the answer is nothing is not personal. It's not conscious. It's not thinking. Whereas God is personal. God is thinking. God can plan and make decisions. And so if we go back to the naturalistic worldview, and I ask the question, can the universe be contingent? I think the universe has to be contingent. I mean, everything we know from Big Bang cosmology says the universe began to exist. But even more so, you can imagine the universe not existing. But if you go through that thought experiment long enough, you get to a prime reality. You get to the floor of reality, ultimate reality. And if you're a naturalist, what is ultimately real is a non-person. Whether you call that non-person nothing, whether you call that non-person everything, whether you call it the universe, whatever it is, if you're a naturalist, you have in the beginning is something, and not someone. That is the big difference between theism and naturalism. But now we go to a bigger question. And I shouldn't say it's a bigger question. It's actually bigger in terms of how does this apply to everyone. I mean, the question of what do you think about God? That's the biggest question. But now, how does it influence my life? Why does this matter? Well, it gets into what does it mean to be a human? And when we're talking about humans, one of the things that bioethicists have talked about for a long time is this distinction between persons and things. Where does value come from? And there are some ideas out there that have said if you're a person, you have intrinsic value. And so value is bestowed upon you by virtue of you being a person. If you're in that category, that classification of reality, you're a person, then you have value. It's intrinsic to you. Versus if you're a thing, you can still have value if you're a thing, but you have instrumental value. And we need to think about the difference between these two things. So an intrinsic value, you see the girl on your screen. She has value in herself. It's intrinsic to her. And therefore, it doesn't matter what anyone else says. If somebody says she has no value, that doesn't matter because she has value because she's a person. That's what gives her value, and therefore that's why she should have rights. Versus a thing, something that has instrumental value, say a car that you really like. Well, a car has no value in itself. Now, that doesn't mean that a car isn't valuable. It just means it has no intrinsic value. It only has instrumental value. In other words, it only has value when someone, a person, says it does. If nobody in existence said that the car was valuable, the car would not have value. Now, I mean, if somebody went out to the parking lot of my apartment building and they found I don't have a nice car like this, but I do have a 2005 Ford Focus. It's just a beauty. If somebody got a baseball bat and they started beating up on my Ford Focus, would we say that's okay because the car has no intrinsic value? Well, no. The car has value because me, a person, I own that car. It has value to me. And so what you need to understand with this idea of instrumental value is a thing has value if it's instrumental value if a person gives it value. But if you're a person, that's where value begins. So let's go back to naturalism and think about the implications of this. So on naturalism, if we ask the question, what is a human? Well, this is connected to our understanding of ultimate reality. So ultimate reality begins with a non-person, with nothing, with everything. The universe is just matter in motion. And so we, humans, are created, according to naturalism, in the image of something, not someone. So I only exist because something brought me into existence, namely the universe, or the nothingness that brought the universe into existence. In other words, the universe is the product, according to naturalism, it's the product of matter and motion. And so what that means is that I am also the product of matter and motion. Now, this brings up a really huge philosophical question. Does that mean that I'm a thing and not a person? Now, that might seem like a silly question to you, but I assure you, philosophers way smarter than me have been wrestling with this question for a long time, especially naturalistic philosophers. So there are philosophers like Daniel Dennett, who has written a book called Consciousness Explained. He's written many books on consciousness, but he's actually argued this whole idea of consciousness, or this idea of personhood, what makes us a person. He's made arguments that consciousness, that first-person perspective, is really just an illusion. And the reason why is because he's a naturalist, and he recognizes that all of my thoughts, hopes, and dreams are governed by particular laws of chemistry in my brain, and below that, they're being governed by specific laws of physics. And if you want to get down to quantum physics, you can talk about protons, neutrons, electrons, up quarks, down quarks, all that stuff. But at bottom, everything that makes me, if I'm a naturalist, is governed by physical laws. And there's no person being a part of that equation. It's just very complex computation, very complex matter in motion. And therefore, this idea that I'm a person and not a thing is just an illusion. Now, for most people, that seems like an insane idea. Like, of course I'm a person. If there's anything that's obvious, it's that I have hopes and I have dreams. It's not just matter and motion. I have a spirit, I have a soul, I have a mind, I can think. I am disconnected from my body. Most people see that. But according to naturalism, since it's a monistic worldview, I am one with my body. Contrast that with theism. Remember, theism is a dualistic worldview. If you start with theism, Christian theism, you have in the beginning God. In the beginning, someone. So you're created, if you're creating the image of this God, you're creating the image of someone, not something. And so Christianity begins with a person, and persons have intrinsic value. So from a Christian perspective, what does it mean to be a human? Well, we're created in the image of God, someone. We're created in the image of the one who is infinitely valuable, and therefore you have value. So this is why human persons have intrinsic value. So just to sum up, your textbook talks about words like reductionism, physicalism. This is all related to this. Theism is a dualistic worldview, and if you have a theistic understanding of ultimate reality, God creates a universe that's separate from him, then this helps you understand what's called mind-body dualism, or what it means to be a human. So I have a brain, a body. It's a real physical thing that I have, but I am not just my brain and my body. I'm not reduced to that. I also have a mind or a soul or a spirit that's disconnected from my body. It's not physical. It's not bound by time and space. I have a mind that's separate from my brain. And that's where things like decisions exist. Things like free will. I can decide to raise my arm. And when my arm goes up, if I ask you, why did my arm go up? You're not going to give me some law of chemistry why arms sometimes go up and don't go up. You're going to say that Mike Burhow made a decision for his arm to go up, and what do you know? His arm went up. That is dualism. You have a mind that can control things in your body, and it's separate from your body. If you're a naturalist and you're a monist, then it's hard to get around the idea that you are simply reduced to your brain. As Bertrand Russell once said, a famous atheist, famous naturalist, I am but all of my hopes, dreams, desires, ambitions are nothing but an accidental collocation of atoms. That's what makes you, you. And it brings up a question: how, on a naturalistic worldview, could I be a person? Now, naturalists try to answer that question. I don't want to pretend that they don't. But from my perspective, that is the whole project of trying to answer that question from a naturalistic perspective seems like a hopeless pursuit. And I don't say that because I haven't read what naturalists have to say. I've read a lot of what they have to say, and it seems like a hopeless pursuit. To start with third-person matter and motion, and somehow that gives rise to a conscious first-person experience. So again, let's bring it back to why is any of this relevant? Why does it matter? Well, now we get to our last question. Why does a human being have value? And your book talks about this using the phrase moral status. And a moral status is just a judgment about an individual's value and rights. So what makes you have any moral status? What makes you have value or rights? Well, a common principle, this isn't just a Christian principle, but a common principle that many ethicists hold to is that a human person has moral status. If you're a human person, you have moral status, no questions about it. But of course, that brings up the further question: what is personhood? What does it mean to be a person? And your textbook talks about 5 primary theories. So theory number 1 is the theory of human properties. So you are a human person if you are a human. Or say it another way, if you are a human, a member of the species Homo sapien, you are a person. If you have human DNA, you are a person. If whatever properties make someone a human, if you have those, you are a person. This, by the way, is the theory that I think fits best with Christianity. Because Christians say every human is a person. And therefore, every human has value and every human has rights. Now, of the 4 other theories that we're going to be looking at, they're going to challenge this idea. The other theories will say, you might be a human, but that doesn't make you a person. So there are some humans who are not persons. And all I'll say, you can read about this more in your textbook, every moral atrocity that has ever happened, well, maybe that's too strong to say, many of the huge moral atrocities that have happened in human history have happened when you have some group of humans are being defined as not persons. This happened in the Nazi Holocaust, where you have the Jewish people being regarded as less than persons, less than human, where you have those who have different mental disabilities are being regarded as less than human. And so it was perfectly fine within their moral framework to extinguish these people because they're not persons. There have been many examples throughout history where you have some group of people are being oppressed for some reason because they're not being defined as persons. So from a Christian perspective, it's if you're a human, you can't do that. If you're a human, you're a person, and therefore you have value, and therefore you have rights. But these others theories have a different definition of what it means to be a person. So one is based upon cognitive properties. So if you can reason, and I'm simplifying these, you should read about these more in the book, but if you can reason, if you have rational faculties, then you're a person. And every human that doesn't have this ability would not be considered a person. Another one would be moral agency. So if you can make moral decisions, then you are a person. Now, the way that this idea is often used in ethical debates would be in terms of moral responsibility. So, I mean, if you go out into the law of the jungle and you see a lion that eats a zebra, well, why don't we take this lion to court and try the lion for murder? Well, because we don't consider the lion a person. And therefore, if the lion's not a person, he can't be held culpable for whatever he does in nature. He's just acting according to primitive instincts. And so the whole issue of moral agency usually comes up when you have court cases where somebody might plead insanity, where they did some heinous crime, but they get a lesser sentence because they weren't fully a person in that moment, and so they get tried with a lower sentence than they would if they were a person with full faculties. And so moral agency is one theory of personhood. Sentience is another common one. So this one's a little bit less than cognitive properties. This one is just if you're conscious. If you have a first-person experience, then you are a person. And so this oftentimes includes other animals other than humans. And so you have, if you're a pet lover, if you have dogs, and you ever look at a dog, does the dog think, have emotions? Well, it seems like the dog has a conscious experience. So there's probably something of what it's like to be a dog. Even if the dog doesn't have the higher cognitive properties that humans have, there is a degree of consciousness there. And so sometimes people will say we should draw the line at sentience. And so if there's a first-person experience or some sort of sentience there, then we should say that person has value and rights, and that can be applied to the animal kingdom. But then this fifth theory is relationships. And this one, just to simplify it again, you should read about this more in your textbook. But the way I like to simplify this is if you're wanted, then you are a person. And this kind of gets at when we're talking about the distinction of persons and things. So what makes the car valuable? It's because the car is wanted. So the car has value because I possess the car. I own the car. Well, when it comes to the theory based upon relationships, is if you're wanted, it doesn't matter whether you're part of the human species or not. If you're wanted, that's what makes you a person. Now, for this week, as you're working through the discussion board, as you're writing your assignments, I want you to be able to apply these theories to whatever it is that we're discussing. And the questions that we're going to be discussing relate to these theories. So does someone have moral status, for example, if they're disabled? Well, again, from a Christian perspective, if you're part of the human species, then you have moral status. It doesn't matter if you have any disability or not. Does someone have moral status if they're not born yet? Well, if you're part of, again, the human species, then yes, you have moral value because you have human DNA, which gets into the question that does a human embryo have moral status? Again, it seems like from a Christian perspective, if you have human properties, then you have value and you have rights. And this gets into questions about stem cell research, designer babies, abortion, many other topics that we'll talk about later this semester. But I want you to always go back to those theories and try to figure out what fits most closely with how you think about these issues. So I'm looking forward to reading what you have to say on the discussion board. If you have any questions, please email me, and we'll chat more about this next week.